Welcome to day 2 of the Bracewell ESG seminar for 2021. Thanks for joining us again today. Today we're going to have several presentations, including legislative and regulatory developments, international convergence, and the emerging role of ESG in finance issues. We're going to start off today with Scott Segal and Jason Hutt discussing ESG-related legislative and regulatory developments. Jason, Scott?
Welcome back to day 2 of Bracewell's ESG seminar series. Today I am joined by my partner, Scott Segal, who is also the co-head of the Policy Resolution Group here in the Washington office of Bracewell. I think we're following on the heels of 2 great programs yesterday regarding ESG fundamentals and also the litigation risks associated with it. Hoping this morning to explore with Scott what's happening on the Hill and from a legislative perspective with regard to ESG. So I'll kick off with sort of a question just generally about what's happening on the Hill. I mean, Scott, we know and have talked about on day 1 that there are stronger shareholder demands for commitments and disclosures. I think we see an accelerated adoption of various forms of reports, whether those are ESG reports or sustainability reports. There's some competition among disclosure formats and models with lots of different acronyms on the international scale and on the domestic scale. And also, we've talked some already in the seminar about the SEC and the policy swings that we're seeing there, as well as the susceptibility to some proxy fights and the tools being used at that level. So I think, at least from my generation, we all learned from our Saturday morning cartoons that Congress has 3 basic authorities, right? Make laws, hand out money, and investigate. And so I wonder how those 3 authorities are being used in relation to ESG.
Well, Jason, it's a good question, and as you know, you and I have worked together for many years. I've been working on energy, environment, and natural resource issues in front of the U.S. Congress for, coming on 3 decades now, and so I've seen a lot of acronyms come and grow, and a lot of interest in particular issues come and go. What is so ubiquitous about ESG is that it, as the previous discussions in these sessions have indicated, it somewhat defies the definition. Any issue you can think of that falls into the 3 broad categories could be an ESG issue. And what's interesting about positions Congress takes is if I lump together all the bills that have been introduced that touch on environment, social justice issues, and diversity and governance issues, it will add up to a certain number. But if I add up the total number that even touches on any of those areas, it will add up to a far larger number. And one of the inquiries that ESG is making and that investors socially conscious investors want to know about is what positions are corporations taking on legislation that may not be disclosure legislation, but may simply be legislation on the underlying substantive matters. Like, for example, not what are you saying from a disclosure perspective about global greenhouse gas emissions, but what is your position on what the federal government should do to regulate global greenhouse gas emissions? And that itself can become an ESG issue. So it is somewhat misleading, perhaps, to just look at what Congress is considering. But you're quite right. Congress does 3 things, maybe a few other things also, but 3 major items. And it only really doesn't. The legislative function, which we're all most familiar with, is probably the thing that Congress is least competent to execute, because you need actual working majorities in the Congress, and we barely have that at this point. But ESG is something that has been of great interest with respect to some introduced legislation, but also in an oversight context, requests for information from S&P 500 corporations to talk about their own disclosure questions, talk about their own board diversity practices and diversity practices writ large across the enterprise. So we've seen a lot of those questions, particularly out of the House Financial Services Committee. And of course, we've had a change in administration. And when you do that, you have, at the very least, confirmation hearings for the new team in town, not the least of which, of course, is the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler, who featured in his confirmation hearing his theories, at least, about what is material and what the SEC would like to look at from the point of view of disclosure and accuracy and metrics with respect to disclosure on the key ESG principles. Now, as we sit here today, Jason, the House and the Senate are controlled by the Democrats, and as a result, Mr. Gensler has a little bit of running room over at the SEC. But, if there should be changes after the midterm election, of course we have a midterm election in 2022, then what was once open field running for a regulator will become a lot of questions and a lot of blocking and tackling, if I may strain a sports analogy. I think we have that to look forward to.
Recent history would suggest that we'll see a potential for a swing in the midterm elections.
Yeah, I think our listeners should understand that, which is that Joe Biden as a president remains relatively popular, and I say relatively popular because you might not be impressed by these numbers, which stick around just above the 50% mark, but in comparison to past views expressed about presidents is not bad, and his handling of certain critical issues, some economic issues, is regarded with some with some support. Now, we just had a recent report from the Department of Labor on employment, and if we have too many more reports that are as sort of middle of the road as that, or even undermining confidence, then that could change. But he is a relatively popular president. Now, by comparison, the Congress is locked. I mean, consider this: the margin of leadership for the Democrats in the House of Representatives is 7 votes right now. If you look at first-term midterm elections for the party in power at the White House generally loses 11 seats in the House of Representatives on that first midterm election. Lay on top of that the fact that we've just gone through a census, and therefore we have a redistricting year, in a year in which red states have benefited at the expense of blue states. It is entirely possible that the House of Representatives will change its leadership, irrespective of any of these issues, climate change included. Irrespective of what the public feels about the issues, the data would indicate that there's a significant risk that the House will turn back. And as far as the Senate goes, Jason, does the term 50-50 mean anything to you? Because that's the current setup right now. The 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, with Vice President Kamala Harris being the tie-breaking vote on matters that are strictly partisan in nature. Plus, on some of these very ESG issues, we have a diversity of opinion in the Democratic caucus. So we have some conservative Democrats who are much more interested in working with markets than in imposing standards on markets as a general proposition. And so it's not even clear the Democrats control even 50 votes on the kind of lion's share of the ESG issues. So all in all, the Senate could change, the House could change, they both could change, in which case the oversight function is going to switch the other way on ESG issues, and we're going to hear a lot more questions of regulators. Ironically, that's not necessarily good news for the regulated community, because our clients, Jason, are under an inordinate amount of pressure to be very open and upfront and transparent on ESG-related issues. And they would be under that pressure irrespective of what the Congress of the United States says or does. So if it turns out that pressure is placed on regulators by the Congress, it may indirectly be asking questions about our own disclosure practices. So it isn't necessarily a good thing. You can sometimes, even when members of Congress want to help you, sometimes they can love you to death, and you don't want that. And we saw this, frankly, during the Trump administration, where we had some policies advanced by the executive branch that went too far in the direction that the administration thought the business community wanted to be in. And we might have that same dynamic going on if Congress switches and they turn their attention to the Gary Genslers, to Janet Yellen and her special stability committee that's been set up on the Treasury Department, to Department of Justice concerns, to Federal Trade Commission scrutiny of environmental claims, all of these things, to the Department of Labor's on again, off again policy on the use of the question of what pension funds can invest in. So you're going to see there's going to be a bit of a to and fro, particularly if there's a change in leadership in the chambers.
So something you said early on struck a chord with me about a company's position on different pieces of legislation as being a reflection of its ESG policies, right? So as we put together ESG reports and policies for companies, we talk a lot about the potential for misalignment with corporate objectives, right? If you set missions and targets, then you have to follow through, and in some ways this SEC surge of attention and resources towards watching out for greenwashing and that potentially being an enforcement issue. There's the potential for misalignment with corporate decision making, right? The deployment of capital that's inconsistent with the policies and statements you make on ESG. But I think another takeaway from me from what you said is that that your positions on different pieces of legislation and the lobbying work that companies do either individually or through their trade associations could also be viewed as being potentially misaligned with the ESG objectives.
Yeah,
one of the things that I think companies,
yeah. I was just going to confirm your premise there, which is that we have seen shareholder resolutions introduced, or at least discussions from major shareholder organizations with corporate management on the question of how lobbying dollars are spent, and on membership of trade associations and other informal coalitions. So we've already seen that be the subject of some discussion, and I would note. Corporate giving has been a big issue at play here as well, which members you support and what positions those members take, particularly on social justice and environmental issues. And after the insurrection of the 6th of January, there was even more pressure put on publicly traded corporations to disclose and talk about what their standards would be for political giving.
So one social trend that does also support the movement is this environmental justice concept, which fits into the ESG sort of acronym, because environmental justice is where the racial tension in the country sort of manifests itself in that world. How does that sit in front of Congress? What are they doing on environmental justice? I know companies are thinking about, well, do we need to have an environmental justice policy position on this? How does that flange up with our ESG statements? So how is Congress viewing that and investigating it and coming to understand it?
Well, Congress has a great deal of a bandwidth for environmental justice issues right now. First of all, it falls over multiple committees of substantive jurisdiction. Anytime you have that, then you have a lot more members of Congress being able to ask for documents or hold oversight hearings and the like. So environmental justice is at once a legal issue. It falls clearly within the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee on both sides. But it's also an environmental issue and a regulatory issue, so it falls within the Energy and Commerce Committee on the House of Representatives and the Environment and Public Works Committee in the United States Senate. And beyond that, it may touch on issues like urban affairs and the valuation of property and more issues that fall within the neck of the woods of financial services. Plus, in the United States House of Representatives, we have a very activist chair at financial services in Maxine Waters, who's expressed interest in this issue over time. We also have affinity organizations in Congress, like the we call it the Tri-Caucus, which is the Congressional Black Caucus, the Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus, and the Black Caucus, which all at one time or another have discussed EJ issues and put them front and center. So, and that's before you even get to the question of what legislation could be advanced on environmental justice. That's all oversight and putting together what we might call the record that would be supportive of making companies have interest in this. But Jason, as I've often said, even without the Congress, companies would be quite interested in environmental justice anyway. Now, I'll make an observation. Environmental justice, if you were to pass major new legislation that conferred new authorities, amended, for example, the Civil Rights Act to create a specific cause of action for EJ that's different than current applications of law, you would have difficulty getting the majorities necessary to pass such a bill. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't pass in the context of a broader must-pass piece of legislation, but you would have difficulties. And I think supporters of EJ legislation understand that. So rather than forcing this as a legislative issue quite so much, they are using it as an oversight issue. And there's plenty to oversee, because a lot of EJ issues are really a manifestation of the executive branch's discretion. So you think about action on permitting, action on siting, the priorities that are established for environmental enforcement. These are all things where EJ can be used as a metric, and it's relatively difficult for the regulated community to touch that use of EJ as a metric. The one thing I want to remind everybody, people, major corporations sometimes become very upset or believe the critique is unfair as it relates to environmental justice, believe that it's out of time. For example, you might have had a facility, just as an example, that was built, many, many years ago, and then a community grew up around that facility, and now you have an environmental justice issue. So many companies feel like there's just nowhere to turn on it. And what I would remind everybody is, hold on a minute, take a deep breath. Companies invest a lot of money in very effective community relations mechanisms, engagement with their communities, and then they seem to forget they have that when it comes time to reframing the issue as environmental justice. Let's go back a little bit to first principles. Every company ought to have an effective community engagement process, and it ought to flange up directly with your government relations positioning. And you already have the tools for that. It's a question of explaining them in light of new frames, and that's really what environmental justice is about. I'm not suggesting that there aren't more and purpose-built strategies that companies need to undertake on EJ. There are, but you shouldn't forget the fact that there already are some tools in the toolbox when addressing these issues.
So let's take a step back from when you are using the vernacular regulated community, we're often referring to those who have emissions and wastewater discharges and facilities, and they're making something or generating electricity. But so the ESG movement, to me, one of the earlier iterations of it largely manifested itself through the investment lens, right? That those who were putting money into private equity funds were asking questions of those funds about what they were doing to ensure that those investments didn't just focus on return on investment from a monetary standpoint, but also from a social and environmental standpoint. And those questions over time got more and more sophisticated. So as private equity interfaces with Washington and with the Congress, what are they doing? How is that message shifting, just given what's happening on ESG and environmental justice issues?
Well, it's a great question, because that's one of the real sea changes of the last several years that I know everybody is familiar with, and it's kind of the basis of this series that we're doing. If you think about it, in 2020 there were 93 proposals that we could say were ESG related, that were investor proposals, and in 2021, despite everything else going on in the country, there were 121 proposals. So there's been year-over-year growth with respect to the number of investor resolutions that are out there, and Washington notices that. I don't think Washington is responsible for it, but Washington notices that. And as a result, we have seen on the other side of the spectrum, I saw a very interesting CQ roll call survey that was done of new lobbying registrations, which indicated that there had been almost in that same percentage increase, there had been an increase in the number of lobbyists registering on behalf of of S&P 500 corporations for environmental justice issues. It used to be the kind of thing that only trade associations registered for, but now we've seen, and we have this it's a rough metric, Jason, because you could be lobbying on ESG legislation and not use the acronym ESG because it's such a broad concept. But nonetheless, it's a yardstick, and it's a publicly available one since you have to register open and notoriously when you're lobbying. So we have seen a reflection in that investor interest. Also, the investment funds themselves used to say, we're just going to be passive observers of Washington policy. We're not going to do what we do at shareholder meetings. We're not going to jump in with both feet and try and influence outcomes. That has changed too. We've seen a lot more both trade associations that represent investment funds and the investment funds themselves hire up very sophisticated lobbying shops with multiple contractors put on retainer in order to advance their position. So we've seen that occur as well. You may ask yourself, but to what end? Sometimes these investment funds, as perhaps a sign of financial virtue signaling, are in there actually lobbying on the underlying legislation. Take climate change, for example. They may be strongly supportive of clean electricity standards or investment or production tax credits. Also, it's just good business for them because they're enhancing the value of their underlying investments. If they tend to be focused in the direction of green investing, just as an example, then adopting policies like this will make those. It is both a virtue and it is a mechanism that improves the underlying economic performance of their investment. So we see them present in that respect. And sometimes it's hard to divide whether that's an ESG concern or simply smart lobbying that one would do if you're just looking after your investment portfolio. It's probably both, and I don't think they would do it if it wasn't both. That said, I have noticed an interesting trend, Jason, and I know you're an expert in this. You're going to talk about it a little bit later, but I have noticed an interesting trend, which is a manifestation of the old slogan in lobbying that no good deed goes unpunished, because the more we have people, entities demanding clean energy investment, for example, the more discussion we seem to have of supply chain issues. And by the way, that's just a single example. Almost every case you can talk about where you push hard in one virtuous area, you come back with the next generation discussion. So take it back a couple of years. Enormous amount of pressure on the electric power sector to shift away from coal. The shift, of course, goes to natural gas, as everybody knows historically, and then the questions become: what about hydraulic fracturing? What about true renewables? Where do we go from here? So sometimes what we find is yesterday's ESG portfolio of issues in Washington becomes tomorrow's critique of ESG issues. And I think
totally true.
Battery management, battery production for electrification is now supply chain and sourcing of minerals. Getting rid of coal, natural gas, and now a suite of questions regarding gas. So, and those are just two examples. I mean, I could really think of a lot of examples that fall into that category. So that's an issue.
I had a call yesterday with a client. We were talking about a forced labor investigations, and I was showing them the types of sweeping questions that others had been asked in the context of a WRO. And they asked, well, are these the questions that we'll get if there's a WRO? And I said, oh, no. Every time they get an answer to a WRO investigation, they get more sophisticated about the questions. And so everything that the other companies are doing then becomes the basis for a broader scope of questions into the forced labor issue and supply chain management. So that's the no good deed goes unpunished, manifested there.
So what we can advise clients on that, though, is you've got to have a distant early warning line. You've got to have a dashboard of issues, basically. One of the reasons, and I know this is going to sound a tad self-interested, but one of the reasons to have an effective government relations and strategic communications practice riding side saddle with all the other tools you have in the ESG box, transactional, legal, regulatory, technical, is that you must identify issues in advance. It doesn't help if you're always in a reactive mode. For ESG issues, whether it's a lobbying question or whether it's something to be in your sustainability report or a point of engagement with activist shareholder groups, wherever it arises, or media questions, you have to be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. And that means you've got to have all of the tools working on ESG because of its very nature. And if I may, at the risk of advertisement, the question that you should be asking your consultants that work on ESG issues, you should be saying to them, can you help me with message development? Can you help me with identifying what the policymakers are interested in, be they regulators or be they members of Congress? Do you understand the technology? Do you and how robust it is in addressing these particular issues? Do you understand the corporate issues that are related to governance and to diversity, for example? Do you understand all of these issues? Do you have a good grip on it? And if your consultant or law firm does not have a grip on all of those items, they are not comprehensively helping you in ESG. So that's an ad, but.
Okay.
Would you agree that we have all that? Things?
1,000%. That's
leading the witness.
That's the group that I joined in 1998 when Scott hired me, and we've teamed up ever since. So I couldn't agree more. Okay, so this is the easiest question you'll have today, Scott, because you've worked on this issue for decades, and that's climate change. But, I said before that these social trends support the movement, and I don't think that you can have a discussion of ESG without talking about the, climate change and the likelihood of climate legislation, clean energy investment incentives. So what's your outlook on the Hill, with just your finger on the pulse of things as to where that heads, and what do we see come out of Congress? You've already noted how evenly divided Congress is, and perhaps the each house will switch at the midterm. So where do you see that on the priority list of the Biden administration, and what might become of it?
Well, Jason, because there's so much pressure on Congress related to both helping Joe Biden keep his campaign promises, but also the looming midterm elections, and they really don't want to be having a robust discussion of climate change too close to the midterm election, because while it is a popular issue, much more popular than it's ever been in the past, a popular issue in a lot of what we might call blue states and districts, or Democratic leaning or progressive districts. It is equally as unpopular in other areas who view it as an attack on quality of life or job creation and the like. Even though those critiques may be wrong-headed, they're still there, and so they have to be dealt with. As a result, the best time for Congress to act is as quickly as possible on climate change, and that means doing it within the context of, as much as they can, within the context of an infrastructure bill that will be linked to an arcane process called budget reconciliation, which is knitting together a budgetary resolution with some more substantive legislation. Now, that substantive legislation has to deal with the budget. So it has to either raise money, it has to be a revenue raiser, or it has to spend new money, meaning it has to spend money that is newly incorporated back into the federal fisc. And that not everything falls into that category. For example, the centerpiece of climate change legislation has been for some time this discussion of a clean electricity standard, or a requirement that the portfolio of particular utilities or states include a robust percentage of clean energy, not necessarily renewable, but clean. So there's that. That is very difficult to marry with a reconciliation bill. Why do we care? Because a reconciliation bill gets you to the necessity of only having 50 votes in the U.S. Senate, as opposed to a filibuster-proof majority, which is 60 votes, and that's almost impossible under the current political framework. So they want to use this reconciliation process. The problem with that is, I'm not sure I can count to 50 on a lot of these issues. We have, obviously, I'm not going to name their names. We have some senators that are Democrats but come from relatively moderate backgrounds who are not so sure they want as aggressive a position on these issues. Plus, I'm also not sure that a clean electricity standard, at least, meets the test for what can be included in reconciliation. So what does meet the test? What should people sitting at home think about in terms of climate change? Number one, they should think about tax policy, because tax policy does meet the test for inclusion and reconciliation. It raises revenue, or it spends revenue, but it does so in a way consistent with the budget. All right, and there are a lot of different things, investment and production tax credits. There are some new credits that are brand spanking new that are on the table right now, like a hydrogen production tax credit. Never had it in the code before, might have it again, might have it now, probably will. The only question is whether it'll be written correctly or incorrectly. So we've got a lot of things there. Also, look at the EPA. They will use their authority under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and RCRA, the waste statute, to do what Congress won't let them do from a direct command and control regulatory perspective on climate change and on the mixture of resources in the power sector. So it's going to be busy. It's going to be busy whether we win or lose on a CES. Yeah.
On the tax front, 45Q extension also in the mix?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, we've seen a renaissance in interest in carbon capture and sequestration. You know, part of that is because we now recognize that it's not just about the power sector anymore. The power sector has options. It can invest in renewables, for example. But for a lot of industries, particularly industries that are both energy intensive and have process emissions that are related to global greenhouse gases, it's basically CCS or bust, you know, or start making stuff in this country out of different stuff, you know. So it's a big deal. And I recently saw, I'm sure other people did as well, this major investment by BlackRock and Navigator in a new pipeline that would collect CO2 emissions from biorefineries, i.e. ethanol plants, and would sequester those emissions. And we're doing so in order to create, at the end of the day, a low carbon fuel, which would be exposed to a premium coming out of the California low carbon fuel standard. That's creative thinking, and that's the future for CCS. Particularized applications that benefit both from the 45Q tax credit and whatever premium the marketplace or regulations will afford for the resulting product. That's where you're going to see investment in CCS.
Yeah, we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in the UIC permitting associated with that too, with Jeff Homestead and others in our practice.
Yes.
So that's definitely coming. Well, our half hour is up. Since 1997, I've never had a boring conversation with Scott about environmental or energy policy. I hope this lands on that list as well for others. Thank you, Scott, for taking the time to do this. We're going to turn things over to two of our colleagues in London who will have a much more pleasant accent than Scott or me, and that's Joanne and Suyin. They're going to talk about the international convergence on approaches to ESG. So I hope you'll enjoy that program, and thank you for joining this part of the webinar.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate that. Our next presentation is on international convergence on approaches to ESG assessment, reporting, and expectations. Our panel will be Joanne Lowe and Suyin Tan from our London office. Joanne, Suyin.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's session on international convergence in ESG approaches. I'm Joanne Lowe, and I'm a partner in the private equity M&A practice of Bracewell, London. I specialize in acting for private equity houses and other financial investors, as well as international corporates and utilities in the renewable energy space. In particular, I also advise these clients on ESG and human rights matters, including the incorporation of such considerations into investment decision-making, supply chain contracts, corporate agreements, as well as facilitating the effective management of actual and potential ESG impacts associated with business operations around the world. Today, I'm joined by Suyin Tan, also from our London office. Suyin?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Joanne. So my name is Suyin, and I'm a senior associate in the London office of Bracewell. I work in the private equity and M&A space, and I represent private equity and other financial investors, as well as corporate clients in cross-border M&A, joint ventures, and equity and venture capital investments, most notably in the energy and infrastructure sectors. Into that, I also advise clients on ESG and human rights matters, including the UK Modern Slavery Act.
Thank you, Suyin. Everybody, today, before we launch into our presentation, we thought we'd give you a roadmap of what we're going to cover so that you can follow us through this session and know where exactly you're heading. So very firstly, we will start with an introduction. We'll set the scene by establishing the growing significance of ESG as a movement. We'll then look at the policy developments in this space, from soft law developments to hard law developments. We'll then have a quick canvas of the convergence and differences across the relevant ESG standards in the US, the EU, and the UK. And lastly, we'll conclude with giving you some thoughts on how global businesses can navigate the challenges and pursue the opportunities associated with ESG with the help of their legal advisors. So firstly, the growing significance of ESG. I think this is something which we can all observe around us as having developed or gathered momentum very recently. Investment bank Morgan Stanley has very clearly declared that ESG will effectively define the next decade of investing. And 83% of C-suite leaders and investment professionals have come out to say that they believe that the contribution of ESG programs to shareholder value will accelerate in the next 5 years. And they're willing to pay an ESG premium of up to 10% to acquire a business with a positive ESG record over one with a negative record. We also have global ESG assets on track to exceed US $53 trillion by 2025. So in no less than 4 years, representing more than a third of projected global total assets under management. And in 2019 alone, 90% of the S&P 500 produced ESG reports, with the same trend accelerating among mid to smaller cap companies. So we can see now a business environment where ESG is increasingly becoming significant and recognized for its significance. But taking a step back, I think it's worthwhile to bear in mind that historically there have actually been very few hard law requirements in relation to this area. Historically, businesses have always viewed ESG matters or ESG-like matters as something which is more about being socially responsible and doing good. And that involved, for example, community engagement projects, charitable efforts and partnerships, and the like. However, now that governments, investors, and the global community increasingly expect businesses to actively manage ESG matters, governments and policymakers are introducing laws and regulations to address this. So what we have seen in the past decade has been the rise of policy developments in relation to the topic of ESG, with not only increasing number of soft law international or multilateral instruments, but also alongside that hard law legislative initiatives. And just to give you a flavor of what those soft law instruments are, you have instruments such as the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, the IFC Performance Standards, the Equator Principles for financiers, and the Principles for Responsible Banking as well. As for hard law instruments and developments, you'll see from the slide that we have here that there are quite a number of them across the various jurisdictions. I won't go through these in excruciating detail, but I'll flag a few for the purposes of our conversation today. So in Europe, we have a number of EU-level initiatives, including the Non-Financial Reporting Directive and the Conflict Minerals Regulation. Then specific member states or countries in the region of Europe have or are in the process of passing legislation relating to topics such as mandatory due diligence, human rights due diligence, modern slavery reporting, as well as conflict minerals or child labor issues. And you can have a look at those across Germany, France, Switzerland, the Netherlands, the UK, and Norway. In North America, there are also a series of similar legislative initiatives. We have the US customs ban, which prohibits the import into the US of goods produced with forced labor in the supply chain. We also have the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the US Federal Acquisition Regulation ending trafficking in persons, as well as the US Dodd-Frank Act Final Rule 1502. Then in Asia Pacific, where there have been some developments, albeit not as much as this side of the world, we also have the Hong Kong Modern Slavery Bill, which is being proposed, as well as the past legislative initiatives in Australia and the state of New South Wales in Australia on modern slavery. So these developments give you a sense of the policy developments across the globe. And I think there are basically two key takeaways from this for you, the audience today. The first is, while there is obviously a general trend towards convergence globally, in the sense that policymakers and legislators are effectively attempting to tackle the issue of ESG in the same way, whether through transparency, reporting, or requiring certain due diligence efforts to be undertaken, we are unlikely to see a totally unified or harmonized approach across all areas of business. And this is most likely because at the end of the day, many of the jurisdictions that are involved have their own historical legal systems to grapple with, and as well as external stakeholder pressures. So these gaps and overlaps that might arise as a result of these differences are important to bear in mind and to be mindful of, because businesses effectively need to learn how to effectively navigate the nuances in these gaps and overlaps, as well as at the same time conducting business as usual. And this is where we, the lawyers, can come in handy, where we can basically, alongside businesses, support you in building up capacity and know-how in the ESG area. Secondly, as the developments have demonstrated, they're developing. They're not yet quite there. So while momentum has gathered and there have been significant developments, those are still ongoing. And so there still is an opportunity for businesses, as well as their legal advisors, to play an important role in shaping the outcome of the legal and regulatory landscape, as well as the direction of convergence. And this is important to ensure that ESG-related initiatives are not only practical for businesses, but they also achieve meaningful outcomes for the community and other stakeholders. Hopefully that sets the scene for everybody joining us today. I would now like to hand things over to Suyin to give us a bit more of a detailed overview around all the trends that are taking place across the US, EU, and UK. And Suyin, I think one of the first areas that we can start with perhaps is some of the areas of convergence. Aside from what I mentioned earlier, it'd be interesting to hear about other areas in which the US, the EU, and the UK are taking similar approaches.
Yes, thanks, Joanne. And so we are seeing convergence across the US, EU, and the UK. And I'll now guide you through some of the areas of convergence, as well as the reasons driving the convergence. So across the US, EU, and the UK, there are four main areas of convergence in ESG trends. We're seeing convergence in developments relating to policy, emerging global benchmarks, the private sector, as well as civil society. And in the area of policy, convergence is being driven by climate-centric and intersectional policies. We're now being seen pushed by the governments in these three regions. So in the EU, we see economic and financial policies becoming increasingly intertwined with the decarbonization of the economy that the EU member states are all working towards. And we see this reflected in the European Green Deal, the COVID-19 Green Recovery Plan, as well as the general regulatory framework of the EU, which comprises some of the hard law instruments you've seen in the previous slide. But these comprise the EU Sustainable Finance Regulations, the EU Taxonomy, and also the rise of mandatory due diligence requirements, among other instruments. In the UK, we're also seeing a similar trend with the passing of the Climate Change Act and the recent 10-point plan for the UK's Green Industrial Revolution announced by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. We also have the introduction of mandatory climate-related reporting requirements as well as the UK's own plans for its own version of a taxonomy. And over in the US, the Biden administration has made climate change central to its platform. So in parallel with this, we're seeing a noticeable shift in the US Securities and Exchange Commission's position on ESG disclosures, moving towards a more broad-ranging and potentially prescriptive approach, in contrast with the traditional principles-based approach they've tended to favor, which emphasized flexibility and discretion for businesses. And so that's the first area of convergence in relation to policy. A second area we're seeing convergence is in the area of emerging global benchmarks, where convergence is becoming more pronounced around climate change reporting in particular. So we have the practical business needs of global asset managers and institutional investors driving this increasing uptake in convergence around two of these global benchmarks in particular. These are the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which were established by the OECD in 2016, as well as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or the SASB. Relating to that, in the private sector, global institutional investors, because they have operations and portfolios spanning multiple jurisdictions, they've had to respond more quickly to evolving legislation. And this response and the approach they have taken has been perceived to have a waterfall effect on businesses in other sectors. So, for example, we have asset managers such as BlackRock and State Street who have started imposing the TCFD and SASB climate reporting requirements that they themselves use on the companies they invest in. And not surprisingly, this has the effect of the asset managers effectively nudging corporate and other non-financial entities within their global investment portfolios towards more sustainable models and regular climate-related disclosures. And finally, moving on from the private sector to civil society, we're also seeing in civil society across the US, EU, and the UK, mutual influences and parallels in social movements. We've seen the proliferation of climate strikes across these regions, many of them led by school children. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movements unfolding in parallel across the US and the UK. We're also seeing increasing shareholder activism pushing for corporate accountability on climate impacts and the energy transition, as well as the rise of climate change litigation. So that gives a sense of the areas of convergence, but also the very parallel drivers and trends that are emerging, which have caused these areas of convergence to emerge.
Thank you, Suyin. That's very interesting and obviously gives us all a lot of food for thought. But, given the historical differences between the US and the UK and all of the member states that make up the EU, what are some of the areas of differences that we're seeing come about and relating to the way in which they approach ESG matters from a policy perspective?
Yes, Joanne, that's a very interesting observation you've raised. As you have mentioned earlier, given that the governments around the world are taking slightly different approaches to these laws and regulations because of their unique historical, political systems, as well as legislative systems, there remain key areas of difference we need to be mindful of across these jurisdictions. And in particular, we're seeing key differences in the following 5 areas that you'll see on this slide, which I'll go through in turn. So firstly, in terms of subject matter scope, as you can see in these examples from the EU, UK, and the US, we have legislation that is subject matter specific, where it focuses on targeting particular issues or sectors such as child labor, in the Dutch child labor due diligence law, for example, modern slavery, as in the UK Modern Slavery Act, or conflict minerals, as we see in both EU regulation as well as the US SEC mandated specific disclosures in respect of conflict minerals and related to that resource extraction payments. On the flip side, we also have legislation that is more general in scope. The EU is a good example. It has an overarching regulatory framework for reporting requirements and mandatory due diligence, as we have seen, many of which are not limited by sector or focus. And secondly, in terms of the approach being taken in the legislation, we see a distinction between process-driven legislation as well as outcome-driven legislation. So process-driven legislation tends to be more codified and prescriptive in nature. So for example, the EU disclosure regulation, more commonly known as SFDR for financial products, is a good example of a pretty codified approach to legislation. And on the other hand, we have outcome-driven legislation, which tends to be more principles-based in nature and tends to rely on introducing the concept of materiality thresholds. So for example, we see that in the UK Financial Conduct Authority's proposed marketing disclosures principles for financial products. And we are also seeing that in the SEC's human capital disclosure requirement that they've recently introduced. And thirdly, we also have the area of the standard of proof. And we're seeing actually significant variances between the standard of proof across different legislation. So going back to the example of the US customs ban, which Joanne mentioned earlier, this act, for example, requires a lower standard of proof where the US Customs Authority only needs to be reasonably certain as opposed to being conclusively certain in order to be able to issue withhold release orders for imports that they suspect have been implicated in forced or indentured labor. On the other hand, we're seeing across the Atlantic a higher standard of proof being associated with the French law of vigilance, but in the reverse direction. So under this law, a French parent company is explicitly excluded from being liable for the actions of others. And this means that a significant burden of proof for causation then falls on the claimant, where victims have to prove that their loss was suffered due to the absence of an effective vigilance plan drawn up by the French parent company. And you can see how having to make such an establishment based on a hypothetical absence of a hypothetical effective plan can be very difficult for the victim. Fourthly, we also consider, when we consider the liability and enforcement regime for these different legislative instruments, there is again a range in the nature and extent of liability. So under the US customs ban, for example, the liability can be significant. It includes both economic penalties in the form of the exclusion and seizure of imports, as mentioned earlier, and it extends to criminal liability, where criminal investigations are conducted into importers whose imports are suspected of having associations with forced or indentured labor. And on the other hand, we have legislation such as the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and California's Transparency in Supply Chains Act. These are perceived to have softer enforcement regimes, where the consequences of failure to comply are reputational damage or injunctive relief brought by the government to compel compliance. So quite a different approach and outcome compared to the liability under the US customs ban. However, having said that, it's actually worth noting that in response to recent civil society pressure, the UK Modern Slavery Act is actually set to move towards a harder enforcement and liability regime with the introduction of financial penalties for failure to comply with reporting requirements under the Act. So perhaps we can see this as a sign socially and politically that the direction of travel these days is very much towards tougher enforcement. And having gone through those four areas, just a final point in terms of jurisdictional scope. We have some of this legislation being local in jurisdiction, for example, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. Other legislation, particularly in the UK and the EU, tends to be extraterritorial in jurisdiction. So, for example, under the UK's Modern Slavery Act and the soon-to-be proposed EU law for mandatory human rights and due diligence, these are examples of laws with extraterritorial jurisdiction that that will give the English and European courts jurisdiction over the overseas subsidiaries, operations, and supply chains of both UK and EU businesses. So that's a roundup of the landscape we have at the moment in terms of convergence and differences and why we're seeing these trends in each of those fields. And for you in the audience today, what does this all mean for you as a business, practically speaking? One of the first questions I imagine you might have is whether these trends will impact you and whether they'll impact everyone equally. So if you're a business today, regardless of your size, sector, location, ownership, or structure, ESG matters are going to be relevant and they are going to have an impact. This includes those in businesses that are funds, joint ventures, and law firms. And given that this is impactful and relevant to all businesses, as a business, you would also want to be aware of the problems that can arise from the differences and inconsistencies in the global ESG trends that we discussed earlier. So we'll look at a few of the most significant differences we're seeing and what implications this might mean for you as a business. So if you recall, one of the differences we discussed earlier is the distinction between a codified and prescriptive approach to ESG legislation, which we commonly see in EU legislation or legislation coming out from EU member states, versus a principles-based approach to legislation, as we tend to see in legislation in the UK and the US with their common law systems. So there are tensions within the spectrum of approaches, and this can cause, in fact, a variety of problems for businesses. First, one of the problems we see it causing are operational challenges, where businesses must tackle differences in costs and reporting when alternating between the more onerous and prescriptive approaches based legislation versus legislation that's based more on principles and that are oriented towards materiality thresholds. Businesses must also figure out how to efficiently address inconsistent demands on operations and supply chains in different jurisdictions. So this can cause a lot of tension and difference in a business that has operations and supply chains spanning across different jurisdictions. And if you're an investor, it can also cause difficulty in making accurate comparative risk assessments between the different companies and businesses that you might want to invest in. So in the US, we have this inclination towards voluntary principles-based materiality disclosures, as we had discussed previously. This approach has actually been seen by certain commissioners of the SEC as producing non-standardized, inconsistent, and incomparable disclosures. And these have the effect of actually hindering investors' ability to properly price and compare ESG risks and opportunities across a range of businesses and assets they might be interested in investing in. Having said that, on the other hand, while there are issues with the principles-based disclosures, we're also seeing that more prescriptive approaches to laws comes with a different set of risks and challenges. And those are the risks of creating a compliance-driven culture, which tends to be focused on checkbox exercises instead of an outcomes-driven culture that emphasizes compliance with the spirit of the law and not just the letter of the law. So businesses that conflate satisfying procedural compliance requirements with an effective ESG risk mitigation strategy may find themselves in a very different, more compromised position and risk profile in the medium to long term, in contrast to those businesses which have evaluated their businesses from a holistic perspective that takes into account the desired outcome and impact of ESG legislation. And so another significant challenge that will confront businesses is the need to rapidly react and adapt to the constantly evolving demands of ESG legislation. As Joanne mentioned earlier, this is a developing field, and some of the developments can be quite fast-paced. So in having to respond to these developments, businesses will also have to then find a satisfactory resolution for the tensions that are equally inherent within some of these evolving legislative regimes. So let's take the case of disclosure obligations as an example. The nature of current disclosure obligations and the liability regimes that are pre-existing and surrounding those disclosure obligations actually has the effect that compliance can paradoxically sometimes bring a business both protection when it complies with those obligations and has a legal defense, but it can also bring an increased risk of liability. For example, disclosures that are required to be made by way of a prospectus or annual report have a heightened liability risk for businesses, in contrast with disclosures that are made by way of a circular to shareholders, providing them with information before an annual general meeting, for example. There is also a tension for businesses found in having to adhere to principles-based disclosure requirements that do not stipulate specific or objective criteria. So, ironically, while the reasoning for this is that businesses would benefit more from greater flexibility and discretion with principles-based disclosure requirements, in fact, this lack of specificity and substantive guidance can inadvertently increase the uncertainty and therefore the liability risk for businesses. So an example of this would be in the US SEC's human capital disclosure requirements, there's an absence of the definition of materiality thresholds. So businesses are kind of left to their own devices in figuring out what would be a reasonable materiality threshold for them to consider when having to make their disclosure requirements. Separately, as another example, businesses are also having to respond with relatively short notice to the rise of mandatory due diligence requirements in relation to global supply chains that we're seeing in the EU, which Joanne touched on earlier. There's also a parallel trend towards parent company liability being established for specific actions of its overseas subsidiaries. So in particular, we saw this in a series of recent high-profile English court judgments, such as the case of Okpabi and Royal Dutch Shell, and also the case of Vedanta Resources and Concola Copper Mines. So the risk of parent company liability arising from the loss of a single jurisdiction, for example, which has been brought about by the recent English court cases, can compel multinational businesses to make hasty and reactive rather than strategic adjustments to their global operations and supply chains. And as you can imagine, this can cause disruptions to the business, while at the same time not fully or adequately addressing the new liability risks that have arisen for them. So those are some examples of the challenges that businesses are going to be facing in navigating a response to these ESG trends and evolving legislative regimes. But there's always a flip side. So in the context of the uncertainty we've discussed, there are also going to be opportunities to explore in addition to these challenges. So I'll now turn over to Joanne, who will take us through a look at what practical opportunities there are available to businesses in this context.
Thank you, Suyin. And before I move to the kind of specific opportunities that businesses can look at in this space, I think the question that perhaps is pressing on the minds of a lot of the audience is, it's great. It sounds like we've got more complexity and nuance to overcome associated with the ESG trends that are developing globally. A lot more problems to find solutions to. So what can businesses do? What can we do in response to this? I think at a very high level, there are probably three main things you can do. And the first is initiate, don't wait. With ever increasing regulation and legislation looming on the horizon, which we've already seen and will continue, it is vital to be proactive with the strategic advice of various advisors rather than reactive. the reactive approach, as Suyin mentioned earlier, specifically in the context of the recent high-profile English court judgments, can become increasingly costly and enhance the liability faced by businesses. Secondly, develop a coherent global approach. Most of us in the audience today have global businesses. And if your business is not global, you might also still have a global supply chain. So it is important to take a step back to consider and craft a coherent global ESG policy that is consistent with the overarching direction of Convergence and the spirit of the ESG movement. This is going to be more economically and operationally efficient in the medium to long term, as well as compared to reactive and localized policies. Now, there is no particular point, and I think it would be very challenging to designate or identify a particular point where what you put in place today will sort of last. Is it going to last you for 5 years or 10 years? So I think in this space, by coherent global approach, what you're effectively trying to achieve is an approach that will enable you to be nimble enough to respond to developments as they basically arise. And that is the key sort of underlying principle behind developing an ESG policy that applies across the globe and is consistent with the underlying spirit of the movement. Lastly, engage with regulators and legislators early on. I've mentioned this before, and I'll mention this again. Don't feel that as businesses, you're basically simply subjects of or victims of these developments. Regulators and legislators do launch consultations ahead of introducing key pieces of regulation. And so there is, through that, as well as public opinion and other forms of media, the opportunity to shape and define the regulatory landscape. So, do encourage businesses to speak up and to actually address what will work for them in practice. And if there are problems perceived with proposed initiatives, what those problems are, how you can address them while still staying true to the spirit of the ESG movement. So what can all of this come down to practically? And I think essentially there are the sort of 5 practical steps that a business can take in applying these 3 principles. And the first is to embed ESG into your policies and management systems. Here it's absolutely crucial that you as a business stand for something, and that is something that is identifiable and understandable by all relevant stakeholders, including the public. The second thing to do is to ensure that you have and continue to do so, identify and assess adverse impacts or risks in all of your operations, your supply chains, and your business relationships. Now, in this area, the key nuance or the key piece of a commercial judgment that needs to be exercised is to ensure that this exercise is conducted in the context of a proportionate and reasonable framework of risk. So it's not done kind of in a vacuum, in the sense that you expect to be able to guarantee that you have eradicated 100% any issues relating to ESG in your business, but rather that you have, in response to the kind of risks that you're facing, implemented and assess risk in such a way as to address them effectively. The third area is to actually implement or put in place systems that allow you to cease, prevent, or mitigate and manage these adverse impacts or risks. And this is a bit more procedural than most, in the sense that here it is about putting in place systems, policies, and procedures which allow members of your organization to basically manage the adverse impacts and risks in an organic way alongside their day jobs. The fourth area is to track implementation and results. And as similar to the third point about your systems to cease, prevent, or mitigate these impacts or risks, tracking them and recording those results should be something that is also organic to your organization. A system that allows people to do this alongside their day job. And lastly, and importantly, it's about how you communicate the way in which you're addressing ESG risks and impacts. And in this space, as Suyin mentioned before, there is a delicate balance to strike here for businesses between ensuring that they communicate, they address these issues effectively, so that should an issue arise, they can demonstrate that they've taken adequate steps to address it, at the same time as ensuring that they do not basically overstate or overclaim to be doing something in the ESG space that they are unable to do or have not actually done. And that's just about walking the walk rather than just the talk. So, what are the opportunities, therefore, in the space of ESG? And I think it all comes down to one thing, which is businesses that can demonstrate effective ESG management and can actually maneuver themselves into a position where they can differentiate themselves as a business around ESG matters are more likely to become increasingly attractive to investors and shareholders as momentum gathers around the ESG movement. Not only that, but we'll start to see, if we're already starting to see, but we'll continue to see the playing field level a little bit, such that those who are not doing these or not addressing ESG matters effectively will sooner or later become increasingly more evidently behind the curve. And as a result of that, subject to additional scrutiny, whether from public, the community, or investors and other stakeholders. So in conclusion, and here are some of the key takeaways for the audience today, ESG matters are relevant to all businesses. So please do not think that because of your size or your sector or your location, ownership and structure, that somehow means that you would escape some of these provisions. ESG encompasses all or any types of businesses, depending on where they are and what they do. They may be subject to different standards or different requirements, but nonetheless, they are still falling within the scope of ESG matters. Secondly, as ESG laws and regulations increasingly enter into the force, the emphasis is obviously starting to expand beyond just pure reporting and disclosure requirements. We are currently seeing a huge movement towards mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence. And so businesses really do need to start preempting what that will look like and preparing themselves with the capability and know-how to address that. Third, as Suyin outlined, global convergence is being driven by a combination of policy, global benchmarks, and private sector and civil society factors. And whilst there is there are evidently overlapping principles and convergence around these areas, a unified approach is unlikely in practice. And so these gaps and nuances that arise in practice as a result of this is something which businesses will early on have to grapple with. And so it is wise to start getting your head around them at this stage before it runs away from you. And lastly, and for fear of being repetitive, I would mention once again that it is absolutely essential for businesses that wish to thrive in this rapidly evolving ESG landscape to actually be forward-looking and strategy-driven instead of reactive and prescriptive in their approach. And that's all from us today. I hope very much that you enjoyed the discussion and the session with us. And we've also got a screen up with our speaker bios. So feel free to get in touch with us if you have more specific questions and queries. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Next up is Fernando Rodriguez Marin, speaking on the emerging role of ESG in corporate valuation and finance. Fernando?
Hi, my name is Fernando Rodriguez. I'm a partner at the New York office, concentrating on project finance and been dedicating a lot of my time to ESG issues in the recent years. Today, I'm going to be talking about the emerging role of ESG in corporate valuation and finance. And I'll start by saying that environmental, social, and governance issues have actually been a concern for investors and lenders for a long time. It was not until the 1980s that ESG concerns, however, started to be addressed as an integrated area of concern affecting companies or a borrower's risk profile. ESG considerations became key indicators of risk initially in the context of project finance transactions, most typically internationally, as a direct reaction to the occurrence of disasters in projects that cause widespread environmental damage, massive social displacements, or involve fraud and corruption. As a consequence, the International Finance Corporation and a number of banks launched the Equator Principles in 2003, which were based very much on IFC policies. The Equator Principles apply to project finance and related project advisory services and corporate loans and bridge loans. The principles, as they're currently published, include the review of and categorization of risks divided into environmental and social assessments, and they categorize between three levels of risk. What's interesting about the Equator Principles is that they really the banks that participate in them require specific covenants and specific verifications of the covenants with respect to environmental and social compliance. Of course, in reviewing these principles, the Equator banks apply IFC performance standards and World Bank Group environmental health and safety guidelines. At the same time, outside of finance, but in a general context, nations starting at the UN, starting with the Rio Conference in 1992, the concept of they started discussing and agreeing on a consensus on the value of sustainable development, and as part of those UN initiatives, the UN member states agreed that sustainable development was a goal and it tied with the UN Millennium Development Goals that currently called Sustainable Development Goals, that call, among other things, for the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger and the ensuring of environmental sustainability and the combating of climate change, among other things. I would also mention the UN Sustainable Development 2030 goals, which promote the achievement of 17 Sustainable Development Goals by member states, and which really have been, if you like, accompanied by the UN Paris Agreement, which, as you know, has a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 1.5 degrees Celsius globally. There is a consensus really on the need for sustainable growth. And as an example of this global consensus, I would cite the European Commission Action Plan, where the EU indicates that the financial sector really has a key role to play in reaching these goals, as large amounts of private capital could be mobilized towards sustainable investments. However, we need to ensure that the regulatory framework supports a reorientation of capital flows towards sustainable investments while ensuring financial stabilities. To achieve this end, capital markets are key. The European Commission Action Plan aims to further connect finance with the specific needs of the European and global economy for the benefit of the planet and our society. The Action Plan has three objectives: to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investment, to manage financial risks stemming from climate change, natural disasters, environmental degradation, and social issues, and to foster transparency and long-termism in financial and economic activity. The company's concern with sustainable development is also not new. Until now, I was just talking about banks financing and financial entities concerned with sustainability and UN member nations. But also there's been significant discussions or significant growth of actions among private companies to facilitate how to assess the way the business assess sustainability challenges. For instance, starting in 1995, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development came up with its own platform to foster the participation by private companies or the adaptation by those private companies of sustainability challenges. This initiative was followed by the creation of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment in 2006, which are now supported by large institutional investors with a total of 82 trillion in assets under management. And the U.S., as a comparison, the U.S. gross national product is 1/3 of that. The principles for responsible investment are voluntary principles established by institutional investors to incorporate ESG in investment analysis and decision making, incorporate ESG in ownership policies and practices, seek appropriate ESG disclosures by the entities in which they invest, promote the responsible investment principles and enhance its use and report to members about the progress and activities. In other words, to try to make it a tool that is used and widely shared among the members. Finally, I will cite the UN Global Compact, which has a voluntary management model for companies with a call to align around 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. The Global Compact strives to achieve corporate sustainability. I would just note that these are just 3 of the main initiatives that have been taken by the private sector to achieve sustainability. But there are many other country or sector-specific initiatives, such as the Global Oil and Gas Industry Guidance for Sustainable Development, which was published by IPECA in 2015. There's a growing consensus on that ESG standards are a value proposition, right? There is consensus that ESG risks really impact financial performance, and that companies that are better equipped to respond to ESG risks have better financial performance overall and can present more resilient financial results generally. I would note in this regard that the industry has been responding to this trend by the creation of indices that track the performance of ESG companies as compared to the general market. I will cite, for instance, the J.P. Morgan JESG index that was developed with BlackRock that includes ESG factors in its composite benchmark, covering 170 countries and more than 650 issuers. It is there's data available that shows how the ESG indices compare in performance with general market indices, generally in favorable terms. There's a consensus now that, of course, about the fact that ESG is a measure of value of companies. In a 2015 survey by the Certified Financial Advisors Institute, 73% of portfolio managers and research analysts considered ESG issues, indicated that they consider ESG issues in their investment decisions. So, yes, ESG policies are a value proposition. There are some common themes on the different initiatives to foster the establishment of ESG policies, and those themes I can summarize them as being, generally 6. First, there needs to be a definition of what those goals are, and they have to be clearly spelled out, and they have to be assessed normally against benchmarks that are agreed in the market and verified, either internally as checked against benchmark or externally. Those goals have to be ambitious. They have to represent an improvement over the prior conditions of a particular company. And they have to be consistent, so you cannot have a short-term solution. This is not a one-off. It has to be part of a company's policy and show and continuous improvement. They have to be committed and engaged by the companies. There has to be an integral part of a company that they need to comply with ESG at all levels has to be part of the ethos and management of a company. The ESG goals have to be transparent, and the reporting has to be done in a transparent way. And of course, all this can only be achieved with strong leadership. So the financial markets, the markets for debt, have not been completely absent from this discussion. In fact, capital markets, debt markets have been creating projects that are ESG compliant for some time now, starting initially with green bonds and moving to social bonds and other types of and loans that designed to achieve these objectives, which I'm going to be summarizing now for you. First of all, green bonds. I have to say, before I start with the green bonds, I just wanted to say that all these financial products that I'm going to be describing now really now represent in total a market that has surpassed or exceeded $700 billion globally in 2020, which is a 29% increase over the 2019 numbers, according to Bloomberg. This is a huge growth of what would have been just 20 years ago a kind of fancy and esoteric products. So let's go quickly over the different some of the different principal products, and I'll start with I'll divide them between sort of capital markets and loan markets products. First, we'll start with the green bonds, where we're the first ones to arise. What I'm going to be describing are just summaries of the principles that were published by the International Capital Markets Association and have been, are updated often. What distinguishes a green bond is the use of proceeds. In a green bond, the net funds must be invested in eligible green products. Green products are described in an annex of the principles and include many kinds of green types of projects, such as renewable energy projects, energy efficiency, pollution prevention and control, water, and the like. This list is indicative; it's not exhaustive, and it can be, there may be other green products that could be added to it. The important thing is that projects must provide a clear environmental benefits. They have to be accessible, and where feasible, they have to be quantified. The benefits have to be quantified by the issuer. In order to issue green bonds, the process of project evaluation and selection is important, because the issuer has to communicate to the market that it has a sustainability policy, that it has sustainability objectives, and it has to have a process to describe how the eligible green projects that it tends to fund with a particular issuance fit in with the categories and eligibility and of such projects. Another important principle applicable to green bonds is how to manage the proceeds. Net proceeds have to be credited to some sub-account, or they have to be separately reported in the company's accounting or a similar mechanism, so that the use of the funds for the particular green project can be tracked. And I'd like to say that those projects can be financed both in development, and it could be there could be also projects that would be already in operation and that are acquired by the issuer with the proceeds. Another important area, and in keeping with the general themes that I talked about before, is reporting. The green bonds issuer has to commit to provide an annual report on the use of funds, and if the funds are to be used for more than one project, a distribution and allocation of the funds among projects, and they have to report also on the impact. Here is an area where green bonds have been evolving. Up to now and right now, there's from my experience, a lot of the reporting is done on a qualitative basis, and the reporting on KPI achievement is, in other words, the achievement of the goals that of quantitative goals, such as reduction of greenhouse emissions by a certain percentage, is qualified as being done to the extent feasible, and this is important because it isn't always completely feasible to achieve that type of calculation, and it is important for an issuer not to overpromise or mislead the market. And finally, and sometimes to avoid this or to facilitate this, the use of the bonds proceeds have to be reviewed. And then, where appropriate, it depends on the case. They can be reviewed by a third party that provides a second party opinion. They can be self-certified by the company against some external standard, or it can be done by a third party providing a rating. A second product that's developed that is interesting and that has not been used as much as the others, but is growing actually exponentially, is the social bonds. These combine really an interest in investing in projects that are really addressing pressing social needs with the achievement of a financial result. I have a list of those of the potential uses of these of the net funds of these bond issuances, but they include affordable basic infrastructure, access to essential services like health, education, affordable housing, food security, socioeconomic advancement and empowerment, etc. I mean, this is, again, not an exhaustive list, but it is an indicative list of potential social uses of these social bonds, net funds. Social bonds, of course, they share with the green bonds the fact that the selection of the bond and the selection of the actual project that is going to be used has to be clearly outlined, and it has to be consistent with the issuer's policy, and of course there has to be transparency in all these issuances. And of course, like in the case of green bonds, they have to be the funds have to be sort of separated so that they can be tracked, and the allocation to the different projects have to be clear and verified, and there has to be some reporting of the use on a recurring basis. A third type of bond that is developed is a kind of a combination of green and social bonds. They're called sustainability bonds, but they're really bonds where the issuer commits to invest the funds in a combination of green and social projects. These are, basically share the same features of the other two. A fourth type of bond has recently been created and sort of codified, if you like, by the industry, and it actually is following an initiative of the loan markets, interestingly, which is the sustainability-linked bonds. These bonds are they really are just any kind of bonds, right? They can be bonds that are issued for general corporate purposes, but the financial characteristics and the structure of the bond, most typically the coupon, is subject to change depending on the achievement of certain specific performance targets that and based on the certain key performance indicators. In these type of bonds, of course, since what we're doing is we're rewarding the achievement by the issuer of certain targets against its prior, if you like, against its pre-target situation. It is important that the KPI selection is done in a way that the KPI are relevant, they're material and measurable, and they can be verified externally, and more importantly, as importantly, they can be benchmarked. The specific performance targets also have to be ambitious, and this is, again, consistent with the theme from green bonds. They have to be ambitious and consistent, again, with the issuer's overall sustainability ESG policies, and benchmarked against prior performance, industry peers, and science. This is important because compared to, there can be cases where there are many cases where a company issues a green bond, and it could be a one-off, an initial issuance, but and you do have to have a sustainability policy. The issuer has to have a sustainability policy to issue a sort of compelling green bond. But this is even more important in sustainability-linked bonds, because you really are going to be telling the market that the company wants to improve its performance targets. It wants to improve its compliance with specific environmental, social, or governance targets over its prior actions. Of course, the disclosures on the targets would include, have to include a timeline for achievement. You have to say by when you want to achieve those goals. They have to be verifiable, and then there may be a baseline that has to be recalculated. The targets have to be recalculated against the baseline routinely, and there has to be a clear path for achieving the specific performance targets. It's important in these sustainability-linked bonds to obtain a second-party opinion that would be a third-party rating agency or a consultant specialized in ESG that would verify the specific performance targets and the sort of achievement of the key performance indicators and as and the overall, of course, impact on the economics of the bond. And of course, these bonds share with the green and social bonds that the need to include reporting on a periodic basis and external verification. The loan markets really followed the bond markets, and the Loan Syndication and Trading Association in New York, together with the London-based LMA and its Asian Pacific peer, created the green loan principles and other principles relatively recently. And there's really three main types of ESG loan products: the green loans, social loans, and sustainability-linked loans. Green loans really share a lot of the features of green bonds, where the use of net funds, the proceeds of the loan, really have to be dedicated to eligible green or social projects, green projects, which are essentially the same as the green bonds. There has to be a process of project selection. The proceeds have to be managed with to the extent of possible separation of proceeds. There has to be reporting and verification to the extent feasible or desired. Social loans are, again, share similar features, except that the projects are social projects, as the kind that I was describing before, very similar to the ones in for bonds. I would just finalize my quick overview by talking about the sustainability-linked loans, because these are really actually the predecessor of the sustainability-linked bonds, and they really are. They are any kind. A sustainability-linked loan can be just any kind of loan, including any kind of loan instrument, any contingent facility, such a bonding line, guarantee lines, or letters of credit. And as long as the loan incentivizes the borrower's achievement of ambitious, predetermined sustainability performance objectives. The key in these loans is that the pricing varies depending on the achievement of certain sustainability performance targets measured by KPIs, right? And then obviously, as in the case of green bonds, these specific targets can be qualified. It can be verified with reference to external ratings or equivalent metrics. There's an industry of that's dedicated to verifying the achievement of KPIs and it's providing advice on the overall ESG and sustainability performance targets. That includes specialized consultants and many of the rating agencies that have their own teams. As in the other products, the selection of the KPIs has to be meaningful and ambitious, and they have to be benchmarked against industry standards. Different from, or as a particular characteristic of these loans, there is a sustainability, a new figure in the, if you like, in the loan administration group that's called the sustainability coordinator, which is normally one or two or a small subset of lenders that help determine and calibrate the sustainability performance targets that are proposed by the borrower, and to compare them with standards and make sure that they work. The last thing I would mention is that in order to facilitate the lender's sort of review of a particular borrower's ESG policies and structure, the LSTA has come up with a due diligence questionnaire for ESG, which was prepared with input from industry participants. That is the intention of which is to be used by administrative agents to gather information from the borrower on their ESG policies and to share it with prospective lenders in the data room. The due diligence questionnaire is divided into 4 categories. First, on ESG governance, there's questions on to determine how advanced is the company in its ESG journey. What are their approaches to ESG and who makes the ESG decisions? Again, this is consistent with what we saw before, that it is important for a company to really be committed to ESG, and of course the higher the decision making, the process, and higher in the corporate chain that decision making on ESG is, and the bigger the buyout internally, the better. The relevant ESG factors are also to be checked in the by the questionnaire, as well as the ESG frameworks to be used. For instance, the sustainability development goals, or the task force on climate change, climate-related finance disclosures, or other frameworks. And finally, to require a breakdown of the company revenue where they can identify the businesses and the revenues that the company produces, so that they can facilitate the review by asset managers, as increasingly some asset managers tend to be reluctant to facilitate the funding for certain kinds of businesses that are seen as not consistent with the actual lenders' ESG policies. So it is interesting because in these ESG products, of course, not only the borrower has to be satisfied or satisfy the lenders with its ESG policy, but the borrower has to be willing to lend to a particular business based on their own, of course, ESG preferences. So this is all to in conclusion, I would just say that the ESG and sustainability policies have to be adopted now and are being adopted by many companies and have become a key part of the investment decision by many institutional investors who really put a premium on a company having a well-developed ESG policy that is committed to at the highest levels of the company's management. And, financial markets have responded to this reality, have created green and sustainable debt products and codified principles to orient the continued development of these products, which really have become a sizable part of the overall market. And they're really likely to grow. Thank you for your attention.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for day 2 of our ESG seminar. Great presentations today on the legislative, regulatory, international, and finance aspects of ESG. I hope you'll join us again same time tomorrow for our final third day of this seminar. We'll be discussing ESG considerations and best practices for mergers and acquisitions, as well as going through a number of very specific subject matter areas where there is overlap with ESG, talking to some of our subject matter experts in each of those areas. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks.